we can kick off. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to Tom and James from the IAASB. And I saw, Tom, you recognized that Nerea is back, so we're very happy to have Nerea back as well. Welcome back, Nerea. We missed you. We will have Philippe arriving a little bit later this morning, but I think we're ready to kick off. I think it's fair to say we probably need to give a hand of applause. Well done in getting the sustainability standard out, Tom.
Appreciate it. I take that on behalf of the team, and particularly the task force that has been engaged on it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But first of all, good morning to everyone. I feel like Mark's brought the British weather to Madrid, so thank you, Mark. Actually, for those of us used to hot DC summers, it feels refreshing. You know, we have a little bit of a mix of things that we're talking about today, but I'll give you some context, because I was here at the beginning of July, and since then, a lot has happened. We've completed ISSA 5000, as you just noted. We've approved our technology position. We advanced our going concern project that we're on track for a December approval. We remain firmly on track to approve fraud in March. And we've made significant progress on PI-Track 2, and we'll talk about that today. So this is the topics for this discussion today. I'll focus mainly on 5,000 going concern and PI-Track 2, but I will touch upon the technology initiative and fraud as well. So, you know, when I'm in this group, and since there's been some changeover in the time I've been here, I like to contextualize things and where we are. And I feel like we're really at an inflection point for the board. We're getting to sort of, during my time, the third phase of what we're trying to accomplish. The first phase, you know, the real focus was finishing foundational standards in a timely manner. So that would be ISA 315, the QM project 600, among others. And it really, at that time, was about building a culture and a capacity aimed at greater speed and standard setting responsiveness. The second phase was, now that we've developed this culture aimed at more agility and responsiveness, and that we have more capacity, let's tackle and address the lingering or newly emerging public interest challenges in a way that would be accretive to confidence in the work of auditors and assurance practitioners. So, not surprisingly, LCE, fraud, going concern, 5,000. And we're really getting to the point, by March of next year, those projects will be complete. And so we're entering in what I think is a new phase, and thing that will dominate the boards, but not solely occupy everything we do, but in terms of the things that I prioritize and the board prioritizes, is how do we deal with the impact on technology and digitization of audit and assurance services, and what does that mean in key areas such as risk response and audit evidence and quality management. And so I sometimes when we delve into projects, we sort of forget the bigger picture, and I'd like to remind myself, like, what would be the things that we want to accomplish going forward. So I hope that's helpful to contextualize what we're doing. So let's turn to 5,000. So first of all, thank you again for the note of appreciation. As you know, we approved the standard in September, ahead of schedule, and we will shortly deliver the package for certification by the PIOB. I feel confident that we have achieved the following: that the standard is responsive to the public interest issues raised. It aligns with IAASB's position, so the IAASB's future standards on ethics for sustainability will be entirely interoperable with 5,000. And maybe most importantly, because It's no use having a standard that's not going to be used, that are standards well positioned to be adopted and supported globally. Now the completion, the approval of 5,000 is not the end of the journey. We need to do the things that we need to do to support the initial adoption. That means getting the relevant materials out there, the guidance and the bases and all of our educational efforts, plus the outreach that's necessary to encourage adoption. On that latter point, there's a role for the PIOB too to encourage adoption. And then also to stand up mechanisms to ensure that we're ready to respond. Remember, a key principle of our drafted is not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. There are things that we will not know in the process, and I'm sure we'll get some implementation challenges in the process, and we have to stand ready to respond. And as you know, we're keeping dedicated capacity at the IAASB for sustainability. So here's the current thinking on dates. Really the big things is once we get past certification is the launch of accompanying materials. The idea is to do that jointly with IAASB following the year anticipated of certification in January. So we have a hub, so to speak, of where people could identify the relevant materials for their assurance needs. The effective date, as you know, is December 15th, 2026. Early adoption is permitted, and we expect a bit of early adoption, both in terms of voluntary practice and jurisdictional. So what I thought would be useful is, since the PIOB has been so helpful to us in thinking through the public interest issues, is not to go into every fine detail on it, but to show how we've been responsive on a few key points. So clearly, you told us to prioritize this. You highlighted the need for timely completion. I think we agree that that's occurred. The engagement, the encouragement that we've gotten on engagement on this, we've launched an unprecedented outreach program on this. It included reaching out to new parties in all continents of the world, barring Antarctica. And we had sustainability reference groups that included both accounting practitioners and non-accounting practitioners. And as you know, we've had a robust and transparent consideration of comments, and the basis for conclusions will describe how the comments were addressed. In terms of the scope of the standards, we were asked, not just by you, but by others, to be profession and framework neutral. We have done that. We're really now focusing on the implementation phase, where we're supporting the use of the standard by non-accountants with enhanced guidance, and that's being worked on right now. The reference groups have been very helpful to us to make sure that the language is as clear as possible, but obviously it's a technical standard. We've really worked on both limited and reasonable assurance and being clear of the differences between the two. I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on the independence and ethics and quality management stuff, because we do have a coordination session afterwards. But it is important to note there was a bit of at least highlighted that this needs to be addressed. And since that meeting, if you look at agenda paper J1 and J1 revised that was shared with you, we had a very concerted effort and a programmatic approach to getting rid of the differences. And remember, it culminated in the two boards being at a board table together in public session, confirming the alignment. So I think that is a really important step to give people confidence that we're going to have a package of sustainability assurance and ethics standards that work for the marketplace. Groups and works of others, this was probably the most challenging technical issue that we faced. It had maybe the area of greatest enhancement since the exposure draft. We were relatively silent, not completely silent, but relatively silent on groups. We had extensive coordination with IAASB on this topic, but also IOSCO and audit regulators, particularly the CEOB, to come up with a workable solution. One of the key elements is that you'll see a lot of the principles of 600 in the standard, but also making sure that the terminology was aligned, and you'll see this in J1 for the coordination efforts. This was a work, and I feel confident. I met with the IAASB Sustainability Finance Task Force recently. We've met with C1. They're comfortable about where we landed. What we didn't work on this issue of other practitioners is it to be a loophole to effectively reduce the importance of direction, supervision, and review in the long term. But we recognize in the short term, there may be instances even within a particular network of a firm that direction, supervision, review may not happen. So we provided significant guidance around how that works. On the communication side, this was something that people, in terms of communicating between the auditor and assurance practitioner, we had an element in planning. I think that was to think through where conflicts could occur and to move some of the communication process up front. And then, as you know, we have a require to communicate material inconsistencies or misstatements, the financial statements of if it is other information, so unless prohibited by law. Finally, key audit matters. As you know, we've decided to defer consideration of the inclusion of key audit matters until this standard takes root, get some feedback. Also recognizing key audit matters only exist in reasonable assurance engagements for the audit side. And so that's on our plate. We're not saying that it can't be done. And certainly, assurance practitioners and jurisdictions could enhance the requirements by including some form of key sustainability assurance matters on a voluntary basis. And finally, as you said, the coordination efforts, you see the 7 areas where we eliminated any inconsistencies or concern. So this slide shows you what, as I said, we're not done. The staff doesn't get a full rest. We're standing up guidance for non-accounting assurance practitioners who may not be familiar. This is sort of like our bridging guide. We're doing some guidance on the inherent limitations of sustainability matters. And then we're focusing on some implementation guidance on evidence. So I think this should be useful to the marketplace. These are the areas that people have said that they need the most guidance on. And so this will be released in January, according to the timetable. And here's a little bit more detail about what we'll do in the stakeholder engagement and support. I assume that I'm still on the speaking circuit and others will be as well. So I think we could stop there. Is it worth pausing at this juncture?
Thank you very much. And maybe just a couple of points. We obviously, as we always do, had our preparation session yesterday. This is not an area that I need to open up for comment. Thank you. I thought it was really comprehensive and very well explained how you dealt with our public interest issues, which we obviously also keep track of. And we do note those 2 public interest issues on key audit matters and two-way communication, and we understand where we are and where you are with that. So we are ready to consider this for certification when you're ready with your suite of documents. Maybe just 2 small points in I think in the run up to IAASB also finalizing their standards, and one other one. So the one is, I just think it's really important now to continue, and I know you are doing that continuous coordination, just to make sure that there's that full alignment when it comes to the definitions and so on. And then the other point is, with a new standard like this, there probably will be unintended consequences, and maybe just if you want to just think about it, and you might or might not want to comment now, how you just keep not 3 or 4 years later you will do the post-implementation review, but just sort of keep things on the radar when there might be unintended consequences, implementation difficulties and things like that popping up. But that's literally the comments that we have from our side. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I should have mentioned that we talked about this at our joint meeting, but the idea that we would continue to stay in touch, more than stay in touch, the teams are closely working together, and that the task forces, our task force and their task forces will remain engaged even into the implementation phases. And secondly, on the unintended consequences, it's been very much on my mind too, that we need to keep a monitoring mechanism in the marketplace, the form of which we haven't determined yet. To say that we were so focused on getting the standard up, but I'll come back to you as our thinking evolves in terms of monitoring. Should we turn to pie track 2?
Yes, thank you. You can continue.
Okay, so let me turn to pie track 2. Remember, at the outset, the objective of this project was to enhance the consistency of definitions with IAASB as it relates to listed entity and PI, and to ensure the interoperability of our standards. We already enhanced the transparency requirement in the auditor's part as part of track 1 of this project. The question has been for track 2 is how can we treat the 8 instances of differential requirements which relate to quality management and transparency in ISAs in relation to PIs or listed entities / publicly traded entity. Indeed, I think the board, our board, it has a firm conviction that in the long term, it will be useful to extend these differential requirements to PIs when there is a global baseline in place for the definition of PI in practical terms throughout the world. The question is, how is it best in the public interest to get to that point? And that is really the core of what we've been discussing at the board, particularly in light of the FAQ that was updated recently by IAASB. And so I'll give you a little bit more, which was probably not particularly apparent on the slides, but of our thinking for it. So first of all, IAASB, none of this is a commentary on IAASB. We take their standard and we've worked closely with them on it, and the construct for their PI standard is a relatively new construct that depends upon jurisdictional adoption. When that was clarified to stakeholders, it caused some questions about whether our proposal was viable, because the IAASB has always taken an approach that you either comply fully with our standards or don't. There was no room for jurisdictional differences in terms of performance criteria. That has always been, our sense, the right place to be to ensure lots of the things that are highlighted as qualitative characteristics of the PIF in terms of understandability, consistency of application and enforceability. And so the clarification issued by IAASB, while it makes a lot of sense, meant that our standard for jurisdictions that haven't adopted the revised IAASB definition of PI would go beyond what IAASB has in their standards. And so we looked at 2 options here. And option 1 really is an incremental step to get into our goal about having consistent differential requirements based around a PI baseline. So basically says, for the time being, we switch listed entities to publicly traded entities, and we signal to the public that in a defined period of time to be determined, we'll assess the adoption of the PI definition, and at the point at which a critical mass has been seen, we will consider going back to an approach probably similar to what we have in the exposure draft, where there's a baseline approach to pi throughout the world that's consistent, and extend at that point. So we'll take the incremental step to adopt the publicly traded entity for listed entities and swap that in the near term. Now, option 2 basically would have said, we extend it to pies as defined by the jurisdiction. This would be a first for us at the board. And it would be a first because it would really depend upon what a jurisdiction has done in relation to pi definition for their purposes. And again, I'm not making a judgment that the construct is wrong on the ethics side. We set standards for different purposes. But in my mind, it could set a very bad precedent for performance requirements in our standards. And it was the unanimous mind of the board, ultimately, that it could set a bad precedent for our standards, because you could envision circumstances in terms of performance requirements where certain jurisdictions or groups of jurisdictions weren't ready for a proposal that we thought was essential for the public interest. And they would have said, okay, make the performance requirements contingent upon our local adoption. And this could happen in a large number of areas, including fraud, going concern. Just think about the transparency requirements that we're proposing. And if that was the case, I feel like we would be down a proverbial slippery slope. And so it was the construct that worried the board in terms of understandability to the user, the implementation of it, and the consistency of it being applied globally. And so we felt it was a better idea in the near term to make the progress with publicly traded entity, and then consider, based upon market data, assuming that there's really strong take-up of the definition, to come back and ultimately extend. And we're open to suggestions about how we should signal that to the marketplace, but we do strongly have a view that option 2 is not a viable option. And so, obviously, we haven't considered whether this would require re-exposure or not. We don't do re-exposure considerations to the end of the project. But clearly, it's a core element of our due process, this reconsideration. So there are definitely trade-offs here. We will, as I said, we're united in our goal of extension in the near term, but we are also united in not changing the core model for performance requirements in our standards. So would it be useful for me to pause here?
Thank you very much for that, Tom. And I've mentioned to you that we have quite a couple of concerns around that, which I'll share with you just now. I just first want to hand over to Dave, as you know, was our observer at your meeting, and then I'll sort of try to summarize what our concerns are. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Linda and Tom. Thanks for that description. That was really helpful, especially for somebody who sat through the meeting and read through the materials beforehand. And I said this at the meeting and in our session yesterday, but my sense in reading the board package for the meeting was that it did not clearly describe what you just described. It did not lead the reader to understand, it did not lead this reader, I should say, to understand the implications of option 2. And while it was explained that they were trying to write this in a neutral manner, I think not having that information in there made the discussion among the board members much more difficult to understand for me as I observed the meeting. I would like to add, too, that while at the end board members unanimously supported option 1, I think they also unanimously were disappointed that they were in that position. And And I think that that is also important, which makes, depending on where this goes, which makes the communication of the IAASB, I think, really critical, that you know, this isn't the standard that you wanted to, obviously not the standard you wanted to issue because it's not what you exposed. And I think that there's, that communication will be critical. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. And Tom, maybe a couple of comments to summarize our discussion yesterday. So just going back to your initial exposure draft, and we absolutely agree and take your point that the manner in which you explained and interpreted the PI definition at the time in the exposure draft is not something that you can implement, despite the support and the comment period, is not something that you can implement because there need to be that alignment between the interpretation of the two sets of standards. So we absolutely agree and support that. When it comes to your option 2, and Dave spoke a little bit about that, the manner in which you described it now, I still battle, and I don't think we were clear in our minds when we prepared for this. What do we mean with the jurisdictional differences in the performance requirements, the performance criteria? Because the way in which we understand the PI definition in the IAASB code is jurisdictions can decide which entities should apply the definition, or to which entities the definition applies. In other words, which entities in that jurisdiction are classified as public interest entities and which not. So it's not in our mind so much about how the audit is performed, that you're creating two different ways of performing the audit, is which entities fall into the definition and which entities are out. I do believe there is already those let's call it precedents for that, you know, split between in and out in many jurisdictions. Where I come from, there's a public interest score for private companies, and if you fall below the public interest score, you're not subject to audit. And this is a little bit like that. So we battle a little bit to understand that argument of performance criteria and how that's going to make the audit be different. Because remember, what IAASB has done was also to do a first and try to establish this global definition to at least push some entities up. So I do believe we need to understand that a little bit better, why that option is not viable. And as Dave said, unfortunately, in reviewing the material, it wasn't all that obvious to us. When it comes to option 1 is very different to what was exposed. And I know you said you still need to consider the need for re-exposure, but it's much more limiting to what was originally exposed. So we would strongly ask you to think about the need to re-expose that, and potentially, you know, there is always the opportunity to re-expose both options. So just something for you to think about. I don't think it's something that we need to debate at length here, but I do believe it is something that you need to consider very carefully in the public interest on, firstly, you expose this, and now you end up issuing a standard that's much more limited, and secondly, also just fully understanding why option 2, which is aligned with the IAASB definition, is not viable and, as you refer to, a slippery slope. Do you want to come in? Do you want me to take a comment or two? Maybe you want to come in first.
So, Dave, your point around communication is right, and I think we will definitely explain wherever we come to in whatever form, whether it's a final standard in the bases or in a re-exposure. As you said, we just have not considered that. We don't get to re-exposure. We try to walk through the preferred position. So the performance requirements point, and I thought I'll probably repeat largely what I said, because our papers really didn't clarify it, and a lot of the thinking on that was discussed at the board meeting and in the prep to the board meeting. When people read auditor's report, and it says it's issued under international standards for auditing, they know that they followed our standards and the procedure, the requirements, performance requirements of the standards. In this instance, there are 8 areas where the work effort is different based upon currently listed entities versus. Now, if we adopted option 2, it could the work effort will swing no matter wherever the pie definition is, and you won't have that level of consistency about it. And so, from our standpoint, that is not in the public interest in the near term. Again, I state that IAASB's taken the right steps to get a baseline on pie, but we do not want to be driven by choices made at a jurisdictional level about whether someone else's standards are adopted or not. And as I said, there is no reason that jurisdictions would not say to us going forward, limit this performance requirement in the near term until we could adopt it 6 years down the road. We use effective dates for that. We use consideration of other things for it. We may change our actual performance requirements as a result of jurisdictional matters. But I think one of the things we want people to know is that when ISAs are being adopted, they know what the performance requirements are that lead to the issuing of the audit report. And that is what gives us pause. It's really a model question that we're not content with moving towards. And this would be an introduction of a new model to our standards.
Thank you. I don't want us to have a technical debate because that's not our role, but I do think we need to understand that, and we probably need to spend some time to, separately to explain it as we go through the next IAASB meeting. So I won't open the technical debate at all. I would just say, in my understanding, yes, the performance, the work effort is different, but it's enhanced. It's not, there's still the basic one. So I'm going to basically just take everybody's comments. I'll start with Dave as the observer, take everybody's comments, and then let's wrap up on it. But I do think it's very important for us to, not on a technical basis, but just on a public interest basis, understand whether, if that's option 1 and not option 2, whether this is, firstly, not necessary to re-expose, but whether this is really doing justice to the alignment and coordination between the two boards. I'll start here with you, and I'm going to go around, take all the comments, Tom, and then we wrap up on pie definition. Thanks, Dave.
Tom, I just wonder if there's a simple example that might illustrate this, and so I'm going to use CAMS as an example. If, for example, you adopted option 2, and if in a jurisdiction publicly traded entities were not considered pies, would CAMS not apply in that jurisdiction? Would be the question, and I think that may illustrate, if that's correct, why the board went to option 1.
That's certainly true. Under your example, that would occur. That is one of many unintended consequences from it. Remember, listed entities is, while not perfectly applied throughout the world, it's pretty common. And publicly traded entities, we feel, is a strongly understood enough concept, which expands, in fact, over listed entities because it incorporates other forms of publicly traded debt and equity instruments.
Okay, and thanks, Dave. I think those examples would be quite useful. Thanks, Janine.
Thank you, Tom and Linda. I have actually a question that builds a little bit on Dave's example. Having listened to your explanation, Tom, I'm wondering what this means, option 1, for jurisdictions that have a pie definition which includes PTE, so publicly traded entities, and including, of course, listed entities. If option 1 is is the option going forward, because there are these differential requirements, which you also refer to as performance requirements. That's the CAM and other things that apply for PIs then, would apply for, well, or PTEs only. But if you have locally already a PI definition that includes much more than only publicly traded entities, but also non-publicly traded insurance companies, whatever it is, can be many other things. What does it mean for those audits? They're currently already, yeah, what do they do? Do they need under IAASB? They've adopted IAASB. Would they then fall back all of a sudden? And what is the difference between option 1 and 2?
Let me take all the questions, please, Tom, in the interest of time. Sandy? Oh, okay, thanks. Sorry, Sandy. Mark?
Yeah, Tom, I absolutely get what you say about there being no room for jurisdictional differences in your standards. But it seems to me the fact remains that you put out an exposure draft with a wider definition of PIs, which your board was obviously very happy with. And as far as I'm aware, there was no significant pushback in comments on that point. And it seems to me that the problematic thing here is the IAASB Q&A. And I think it would look, the optics of the IAASB having a different definition of PI to IAASB would be very bad and wouldn't be in the public interest. I'd like to suggest a potential compromise where you proceed with the definition as set out in your exposure draft, but you do not include in your guidance the IAASB Q&A. So therefore, there would be no jurisdictional difference in the interpretation of PI in the context of the ISAs. Just a suggestion.
Thanks, Mark. Robert?
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Tom, for the explanation of the position. Certainly, you've made it very clear your approach to the two options in the public interest. I certainly understand what you're saying about the benefits of a transitional approach to this. I think it would be helpful, given what Dave also said about the board pack, which I haven't seen, but I take on trust what Dave has said, that the board pack didn't perhaps articulate this as well as it could, that you perhaps do some further work to articulate the competing public interests that are involved here. So clearly this is a situation where you've got two competing public interests. One is the undoubted public interest in consistent application of the ISAs. There's no doubt about that. But there's also a public interest in enhanced audit effort and performance in relation to particular classes of entities, which go beyond just publicly traded entities, because we were all satisfied with the work that the IAASB did to push out the broader definition for jurisdictional adoption. So I think it's good to see the PIF being used as the basis of the consideration on the slide, but I wonder whether that could be revisited and considered on the basis of those two competing public interests. In the way in which that's then presented for further discussion. So just that's a comment, and then just two questions. The first question in relation to this transitional approach and saying, well, we'll take option 1 for now and then wait until the benchmark is sufficiently there. The question there is, will there ever be sufficient adoption of the Code of Ethics and the new PI definition jurisdictionally? recognising, of course, within that question that the IAASB definition allows for variations jurisdictionally with the top-down, bottom-up approach. And the second question, I guess, is whether there may be some benefit in where you may already be doing this, and engaging with the national standard setting community on this, because it seems to me to be very logical to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Begonia.
Thank you, and thank you, Tom, for the explanations. Well, I do agree with Robert that it seems that we are using public interest in different ways, and well, one is consistency, which is important, consistency with the definition in the IAASB, not the definition, with the Q&A that the IAASB has developed, and the other is the public interest per se. I think the second is more relevant. So having, well, having a definition about PIEs that implies that only listed entities or public traded entities are going to be assured following a very strong independence requirements is not enough. We are not changing from the prior situation. So to me, the step that we were trying to achieve, the boards and the PIOB, which is going further and having a more strong definition of PI, is now not happening. So you are again in square one, having the basic definition. So I think we are not going towards the appropriate direction. And in fact, PIOB was even more demanding when we were talking about the PI definition in the past. We wanted to have more types of entities covered by the PI definitions, CIBs, funds, etc. So from the public interest perspective, I think that the position to adopt option one is not a step further at all. It is to go towards, is to go a step back. So, and this is not what the exposure draft suggested. So I think that this is not what should be done from the public interest perspective. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to respond, and then let's wrap up on this point?
First of all, we're not changing or regressing at all on the PI definition. The PI definition is set by IAASB. The question before us is whether that has an impact on differential requirements in the audit standards. We are not changing that. In fact, the step we're taking by going to publicly traded entity actually does expand differential requirements to an added group. And what we're saying is that the PI definition as still applies for independence and ethics requirements. None of that changes from our steps. So we do not believe this is a regression. And I do think there are, as Robert rightly says, there's not, in any situation, a yes or no on the public interest lies here and the public interest doesn't lie there. There's competing factors here. In this case, maybe we have the most clear example where there are significant competing factors. And I take the point that both Robert and Dave have suggested that we need to be very clear on how we've considered those two factors when recognizing what Mark said, that the board's intent over time is to move to differential requirements for PI. Now, Mark, on your suggestion, I just would say effectively that would make us an ethics standard setter. We would be requiring, for the purposes of audits, a definition that goes beyond the ethics board's requirements, which were certified by this body. So I don't believe it's for us to determine whether we should reopen the definition of PI. I think IAASB went through an appropriate due process to get to their point. I think it's the right way forward to encourage the adoption of a baseline, and we've set out a path for considering it. So I was asked, I think Robert says, will there ever be sufficient adoption of the standard? I expect so. And the data is that. The way I would think about it at our board would be in the jurisdictions adopting ISAs, have the preponderance of those jurisdictions conformed with the IAASB PI definition. And that is something that the data will drive us to. And I think that's particularly an area that we should engage with national standard setters, both on the ethics and audit side, to get a feel for at what point do we get to that tipping point that makes it acceptable. So, and even before we get to that point, clearly, we had a discussion with national standard setters in May on this topic, but we will need to continue to get to that. Now, Janine, you asked a question of, will this mean a falling back? No, I don't think so. Jurisdictions have always topped up our standards. What we were concerned about is variations downwards or side to side from our standards on the performance requirements. But in jurisdictions such as Europe that already extends requirements to PIs, there will be no change. Because if you extend our requirements to PIs in your jurisdiction, you are still in conformity with ISIS. We're just redefining listed entities to publicly traded entities, which brings us into more convergence and conformity with IAASB. So I hope that explains a little bit of our thinking. I understand this is a challenging area. It's a challenging area because, I want to be clear, standard setters, whether it's we or IAASB, want our standards to be adopted. And I'll let Gabriella speak for her board, but my understanding is that the way they set the standard was the best path to ultimately get to a baseline for PI globally, which has not existed. And we are driven by that factor on our differential requirement consideration.
All right, I think I can wrap it up, and maybe just a few confirmations, clarifications. I thought you gave us really sensible and good responses, and a few things. Let me just be very clear that the PIOB would wholly be against you trying to set ethics standards through the back door in the IAASB standards. So absolutely support the comment that you can't be applying your own definition or ignoring portions of the definition. And yes, we rightfully supported the IAASB standard when it was issued. And adoption is important. Adoption is very key to the suite of standards, but the adoption at all costs is not what is ever the objective. It is really to create the appropriate high level, right level standard to move things forward. The PI definition as set by IAASB was, however, really a first. And that was to try and create a baseline. There was never before, everybody, including the PIOB, many years ago, tried to define public interest, and IAASB at the time managed to set a baseline to at least include a little bit more than just at that time listed entities, publicly listed entities into the definition. So yes, there's always room to enlarge it, and IAASB is doing further work on that, but it is important that there's an alignment in your interpretation of the definition. So we absolutely take that point, and we are by no means suggesting you come up with your own definition, and we certainly also by no means suggesting that this is a step backwards. All of this is a very significant greenfields step forward. Two things that's my takeaway maybe for going forward for your borders, and you mentioned it in your closing, in your comments, is it would be really useful to understand the trade-offs between the public interest framework criteria, and you're right. Those are trade-offs. In some instances, you actually cannot achieve all of them. And maybe the right answer is, in this case, the one and not the other. And Robert's suggestion on how you explain that a little bit better would be really useful, linked with Dave's suggestion on some examples of, if we take this criteria, if we meet this criteria and not the other one, what the potential unintended consequences will be. So we don't want to push you into that place that you so often say is let perfection be the enemy of good. It is important to move things forward, but I do think it's really important that there's clarity. So thank you. We're looking forward to seeing how we can hopefully conclude this in December.
Okay, thank you for that. It was really good advice, which we will definitely account for going into our December meeting. Let me turn to going concern. This has been a topic that we've had discussions on at our board preceding my time, but I'm happily reporting that we're all systems go for approval in December. I'm confident that we're going to have a robust proposal that will achieve universal respect, if not support, because obviously there's not universal support for anything we do, but I think people will think of us as a robustly developed standard that accounted for the various levels of feedback. And we haven't stopped our external engagement so far. We've been meeting with reported standard setters, the IAASB and IAASB, on a regular basis. We wrote to the IAASB, as you know, reflected some of the discussions we've had at this table. It's been acknowledged. I don't expect any IAASB action by the time we issue our standard. However, they do acknowledge that our standard is consistent with IFRS's, so that's a positive. We've continued our outreach with the investor community on the options, particularly around transparency that's being proposed. We had a specific engagement with prudential regulators since we met last, and that's particularly in relation to communications issues, conscious of potential financial stability concerns that could come out with an adverse conclusion on going concern. So that is all occurring. I'll give it the same type of sense. I won't go into all the detail because I'm conscious of time, but if you see the slide deck, we are remaining very responsive to your public interest issues. I think that the key takeaway is that we haven't withdrawn from the core principles that were in our exposure draft on many of the important elements: timeline, the evaluation of management's assessment of going concern, that we clarified what management's expected to do and what the auditors expected to do, recognizing those roles and responsibilities. Our communication in the auditor's report, despite some desire to move the discussion to CAMS, we have resisted that. We're continuing to have things in a self-contained section on going concern. And as I said, I talked about communication with appropriate parties. I'm going to take this as read, if we want to get to other topics, but I'm happy to take any comments to you. As I said, we're expecting December approval. We continue to have outreach as we get to finality on the standard before approval. And certainly, I'm really optimistic that this will provide a real upgrade over the existing going concern standard.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Dave first, and then I'll share some of the thoughts that came out of our preparation session. Thanks, Dave.
Tom, I was just going to ask if I thought it was really useful at the board meeting that there was one section where the board considered a sample audit report with both the transparency disclosures from going concern and fraud in them, and I thought it would be great to hear kind of your sense of the feedback that the board gave you on that.
Thanks, Dave. So we've had anytime we touch the auditor's report, people seem to get a little antsy. My personal point of view, and largely the board's point of view, is that communicating the auditor's report is really important, because it's the one place that the auditor communicates with the external parties and shows the importance and relevance of his or her work. And so what we wanted to prove is that the disclosures that were added for fraud and going concern are workable together without making the auditor's report a mess. And I think the conclusion of the board was they are workable. It doesn't add undue confusing paragraphs to the auditor's report. And there was the usual discussion of boilerplate, but I remind people that we don't draft the auditor's report. It's for the auditor to not draft boilerplate. So that's where we landed. I felt like it was a good example and a good exercise, and it proved that what we're proposing on both sides work together and will be helpful.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Tom. And Tom, as you know, both fraud and going concern, seeing that Dave mentioned fraud too, have been projects that were always very high on the PIOB agenda ever since I can remember. We've been very comfortable to see how things moved forward and how you progressed both of these sets of standards. We don't have outstanding issues. We do believe it's going to make a difference. The one comment, and I'm going to put Sandy on the spot because she made it in our preparation, and is that this is really significant and it's really pushing things forward, and it's potentially giving a lot of very useful information for readers of audit reports, most pertinently the investor community. And we would urge you to think very carefully how you make sure that you also advertise this, that you make sure that people on the other side of the audit report that read it actually see the benefit. Because yes, they might read the audit report. Hopefully when people see this longer audit report, because there's a fraud and a going concern issue, they will think maybe I should be reading it. But there's probably some additional communication work to be done. So Sandy, I'll just hand over to you. You're much more eloquent than I am in explaining how it's necessary for investors to understand this benefit that they're getting out of this work.
Yeah, my comment came in the context of both sustainability and then going concern and fraud together, because they'll change the audit opinion over the financial statements. And really, it was about when this is issued, will there be something that explains it in non-audit terms to investors? And so they understand what the problem was and what has been solved or not solved by that. In the context of going concern, really, it also includes looking at the difference between this requirement and the IAASB, actually, right? But it's an entirety of a different set of language of looking at it not from how the sausage was made, which is what we do, but looking at it from the perspective of what do you receive and what's changed and why should it matter to you. And many people talk about the expectations gap, particularly when it comes to fraud. But part of the expectations gap is just really explaining what investors should expect. And so marketing and communication around that. So it was that comment in the context of going concern and fraud, but also in the context of sustainability, and why I had my card up earlier, was that the next steps all include much of implementation guidance, and that's for people who are going to implement the standard, not necessarily people who are going to use the report. And ironically, after the conversation yesterday, one of my colleagues in a different part of the world had just done a roundtable, and the #1 item on the going forward was people don't understand limited versus reasonable assurance, and this was a group of investors, right? So there needs to be some communication, not starting from how the sausage was made on the sustainability standard, but this is what a report's going to look like, and here's how it's different from an audit report, because that's what they know. And so I think that is that communication is important, not just for using these particular standards or their issuance, but for understanding what the IAASB and IASB do and the PIOB does for the investor community. And I think that's particularly true in the context of sustainability, because they'll see these reports. I mean, they've seen them before. Mostly it's on scope 3, but relative to particularly the ESRSs. So
I think that's good advice. It's, I assume we're going to do that, but your points are well taken.
Thank you, Tom. Tom, we've dealt with the focus areas. There's one other topic where we might want to make a few comments, but I just first want to check if there's anything else from your side that we need to discuss.
Well, the reason why fraud isn't on the agenda today is that we've only gotten through the top 4 issues, big ones, in terms of a redeliberation, and we thought that it would probably be more suited for a later discussion. But to say that they're on track and we're staying pretty true to the intent of our proposals right now. There's no backtracking on it, which I know is, from a public interest perspective, would be one of the big concerns, because we were pretty well aligned on the public interest issues so far. The technology position is also approved. It's on the website. It's really important, and people may say, oh, what does this really do? Just a reminder, our board wasn't committed to write in requirements that specifically reference technology or were impacted by technology. So this is a gated issue in many ways, and it's a signal to the world that we are going to actively consider the impact of technology in terms of the reporting entity's use of technology, the auditor's use of technology, and its implications for quality management going forward. And so this is now feeding into our integrated project proposal for 500, 330, 520. But in my mind, it also could feed into what we do on QM. If you know ISQM 1, it has one paragraph as it relates to technological tools. There may be a hook there for doing more work. And by the way, it doesn't always require new standards or new requirements. There may be other tools in our standard setting toolkit, such as guidance and other implementation activities as well. And so we'll have a thoughtful consideration. But this is really sort of the opening of a gate for a more forward way to think about technology in ISAs and QMs going forward.
Thank you, Tom. Just on fraud, we got the same feedback, positive feedback from Dave as our observer and from our observation staff. So we're looking forward to that. If I'm not mistaken, the intention is to approve that in March. And then on technology, that was the one other area where we had a couple of comments noting that you've issued the position paper, which we obviously support. We've spoken about that before, that in thinking about other standards that you're working on changing, amending, that you really start embedding the technology aspect into all of those standards. So certainly an important step forward to create that discipline to do it, which we support. We were wondering, and you might actually have touched on that, but maybe you want to just specifically respond, whether that is the end of it. You said it's the opening of a gate to start thinking about technology. So we were wondering, will there potentially be some specific standards on technology? If we look at what the PCAOB is doing, they seem to be focusing on a couple of specific things. Not that we're saying that's necessarily what you have to do, but do you envisage that down the line there might be specific standards that deal with specific aspects of technology, AI in the audit, etc.? And the other point that that came up when we prepared is just our understanding of this is also an area, I would imagine, where there's a level of coordination between yourselves and IAASB. It might be very different, but there is also potentially the need for coordination, which we can discuss in the session with Gabriella just now as well, but maybe just a few comments from your side. Thank you.
So whether we have a specific standard related to one particular technological aspect or not is not determined. I would think probably the area most likely to see that first would be in the QM side. We're more likely to embed it in the audit principles that we already have. So 330, 500, could be 200, could be 220. But we haven't decided exactly. In terms of the near-term focus, it's really about what we need to do on 500 and 330 and 520. You know, confirmations is another clear area where technology plays a role. And the standard was drafted probably long before APIs were even part of modern lexicon. So, so my sense is that we're likely more often than not to incorporate it in the existing audit principles, but I don't want to preclude anything on that. And remember, going back to my initial comment, the impact of this technology statement will now be felt in this third phase. This is the real focus. Once we effectively clear the decks of what we have on the work plan by March, this is what's going to preoccupy this board for the next 3 years, and probably won't in the future.
Thank you.
And there's definitely coordination, but I should have said this. Like, our technology, we have a technology team. They speak to IAASB's technology team. Active coordination as we do on everything else.
Good, thank you very much. I'm going to take the last round of comments. I've got 2 cards, and then I'm going to wrap it up and invite Gabriella to join us. So Sandy first, and then Janine.
Yeah, my comment was really just to laud you for the technology position. One of my colleagues forwarded it along to me and said, isn't this what we've been asking another standard setter to do? So it wasn't you, but it was kind of humorous because it was. But I think it's also important in every decision that's taken. So you talked about the audit, the length of the audit report, right? The analysis of technology we've wanted as investors is to consider that in the cost-benefit analysis. So it's not really that long when something can read it a machine can read it very fast, for example, right? So it needs to permeate the way of thinking about how, not only how the audit is done, but how the audit and the work is consumed, so.
Thanks, Andy. We're not in competition with other standard setters, but I'm happy to hear that people are pleased that we've issued something.
Janine?
Thank you. Yes, thanks. Tom, I'm very happy to read that the position paper, or the technology position paper, starts with acknowledging how technology could contribute to audit quality, enhancing audit quality, and that you want to actually encourage the use of technology by firms and practitioners. My question is, you just explained how you see that, which standards would be the usual suspects to include technology in there, but are the standards as such the place then to, if you talk also about encouragement of using technology, how do you see that? Would that be through the standards, or would that be something else?
I think the standards are actually a pretty good place to start. We have this digital advisory group. We have a couple of entrepreneurs on the group. And in fact, there's a sense always that too much standardization could limit innovation. And his point was quite the contrary. By actually being bold about what you put in a standard allows people to innovate around the rules. And potentially one of the things that we've heard that inhibits the use of technology is the concern of lack of acceptance of outputs by the regulatory community. And so I do think the standards are, I'm probably more pro this than other members of our board. We haven't really worked through all the specifics. But I do think the standards are the right place to begin.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much, Tom and James, for the session. Thank you, everybody, for your contribution. We wish you well. There's a lot of work. There's a big chunk of work completed now, but there's always a lot of work ahead. So good luck with all of that. I'm going to ask Gabriella to come and join us, and then we're just going to spend a little bit of time to talk about coordination. Thanks.